Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It all started with a Facebook post, and then another, and then another. And by the time he'd written the Facebook post, How Not to Get Excommunicated, he was being called in for a court of love and shown the door. Tonight's guest is Sam Pinson, who is going to talk us all through the wonderful world of logical fallacies and critical thinking, something we both share a passion for. So, here he is. Hey,
Hey, Brother
Sam.
Mormon. Thanks for
Hi.
having me on your show. I
My
really
pleasure.
admire your work.
Oh,
You
thank
do
you.
good work.
Thanks. Coming from you, it means a lot because it is your excommunication and your kind of challenging of the church by this method that kind of inspired the way I chose to go about what I'm doing now. The real focus on critical thinking and on logic. So it's great to finally have a chat with you about this. But I think we need to start really from the beginning with what is logic and what is a logical fallacy. Why should we be bothered about those?
Well, a logical fallacy is an incorrect way of reasoning or thinking.
Hmm.
And as we get into the discussion, we'll provide many examples of
Hmm.
what that is. Uh, why logic? I think that if it's not patently obvious to somebody why it's desirable to be logical, I guess we can say that one reason is that if we have a difference of opinions about reality,
Hmm.
the way things are or what should be done, morality, that logic can be a mediating force where, for certain kind of arguments, deductive logic, if the premises, the inputs to the logic or the argument are true, then the conclusion necessarily follows. So that's a helpful tool
Hmm.
in working through what should be done in certain situations. Um, if we're not logical, if we don't value logic, then anything and everything can be justified. And so we see that happen all the time. The the sun went away. We must need to sacrifice a virgin to the sun god to bring it back. We sacrificed the virgin, the sun came back. Like,
Therefore,
that's not logical reasoning, and many virgins were sacrificed for fallacious reasoning like that.
yeah, because it's correlation does not equal causation. That's
Yeah,
the it's the
that's
way
a
of
big
summing
one.
that up.
False cause fallacy.
Yes. There you go. We're already in. We are 2 minutes in, and we're already on our first logical fallacy. And I think, to be honest, that's where I want to take the conversation tonight. Generally, is just what are some of the most common logical fallacies in Mormonism. I want to talk to you a bit about how do you spot them, how do you avoid getting trapped in them yourself, these sorts of things. So let's just start with, how do you spot a logical fallacy in
That,
your own or someone else's argument?
that's a good question, and I'd like to preface the whole conversation
Hmm.
with the reality that just because somebody has discovered logical fallacies in LDS theology and LDS teachings and discovered that the truth claims of the LDS Church are not true, that does not make that person logical.
Hmm.
There are lots of illogical people who have apostatized. And so we're all vulnerable. And so everything that I present tonight and say tonight, it doesn't mean that I know everything, that I'm always logical. I, like all other humans, am prone to be illogical. So how do you spot them? I think the first thing is to study them. And when you can label, you study them because they occur in consistent ways. There are
Hmm.
recurring faulty ways of thinking about things that
Hmm.
appear again and again, not just in religion, but in all domains of human endeavor. So if we can identify them, it's like we're learning templates for faulty reasoning, and that all by itself makes it much easier to
Yeah.
see them when we're reading or we're hearing a sermon or engaging with an apologist or
Because it's not just in religion, like you said. And it's not even just in kind of rationality and conversation. So a lot of the elements of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, involve on recognizing faulty thought patterns. So catastrophizing is a big one, which you could actually describe as a slippery slope argument in kind of more formal logical thinking. So there are formal ways of talking about this, but like you said, it's important to recognize that they occur within ourselves in a informal way. We catastrophize. We make leaps. We fill in the blanks. One of the big ones in CBT is mind reading.
Yeah.
We assume that we know what someone else is thinking, often in a negative way towards us, and then we act on that information rather than on the information as it's presented. So it can be helpful in all sorts of ways. So you said to study them. Are there any good resources I could share as to a good place to find them? I could put it in the show notes later.
Absolutely. I mean, the internet is full of fallacious reasoning, but it's also full of resources to help you learn about logical fallacies. Here's one that I bought. This is a used college textbook called Attacking Faulty Reasoning.
Cool.
Edward Dammer is the author.
Nice.
And this is a fantastic resource. Another one that I would recommend is the Rationality Rules YouTube channel. Great content. Theremin Trees also provides some excellent analysis of fallacious reasoning that happens in religion and other domains. Then there's just type in list of logical fallacies into your web browser.
Great Wikipedia page.
And yeah, so there's yourlogicalfallacyis.com, I think, and related to logical fallacies are cognitive biases. And there's yourcognitivebias.is is another great resource. Wikipedia has excellent articles on logical fallacies. Those have been my go-to sources.
Okay, because I want to talk about that takes us nicely to your Facebook post, actually, because what you're doing at the moment is kind of raising a logical fallacy on your Facebook post, and then people are kind of coming in and you're discussing it and you're giving options. Would you feel this way about this? Would you'll change the actors involved sometimes. So would this be okay if someone else was doing it, or is it just okay when your church does it? You'll sometimes change the person being acted upon. So would this be okay if it wasn't happening to an adult but happening to a child? What makes it okay if it's happening to an adult? Because those things confront us all the time. The individual circumstances in which something happens often can lead us to think something is okay that isn't, or isn't okay that actually might be. So you have to kind of take yourself out of your individual circumstance, which I think you do very well.
And a logical fallacy that enters into that picture is the special pleading, where and that fallacy is to claim a universal rule or principle and then without justification carve out an exception. And so people do that with respect to revelation. So when I experience a revelation or a spiritual witness, mine is real and my interpretation of it is correct. And then when you point out that billions of other people throughout history and at present on the planet have claimed to have revelations and spiritual witnesses that contradict each other and contradict yours, then there's the special pleading. Well, they are deceived or they're mistaken about what theirs means, and there's no justification for that claim
for why theirs is wrong.
Just because you said so.
Yeah. Well, so there was some circular reasoning today in the state conference. I know the Book of Mormon is true because the Book of Mormon said it's true. Yes,
begging the question. Yeah, so that's another great one where you spin out of nothing a foundation for your argument. Formally, it's your premise or one of your premises assumes that which you seek to prove. You assume the conclusion from the beginning, begging the question.
Moroni's promise is a great example.
Yeah.
I mean, it's also great because there's an undeterminable qualifier in there, having real intent.
Oh yeah.
Because you can always just blame that qualifier that you didn't meet that.
Yes.
So I don't know if an indeterminable qualifier is the right word for it. I made that up. There might be a better phrase for it, but
Well, so you raise a really good point there. So there's lots of fallacious thinking. There's lots of logical fallacies, and many of them have names because they're so common. There's definitely fallacious reasoning with the Mormon feelings-based epistemology, which is epitomized in Alma 32 and also in Moroni 10. I don't know that there's a name for at least the element of the fallacious reasoning that I'm thinking of right now, but it's the closed loop. It's not falsifiable. There's no outcome where you've asked and you've found out that it's not true.
yeah,
Because, as you said, you didn't have real intent.
it's almost like an inbuilt no true Scotsman fallacy. It's like anything you do that would disprove it wasn't the right thing, and therefore you aren't correct.
I like it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like that's baked in.
Absolutely. Right. So no true answer to Moroni's promise is negative.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So you can kind of look at it that way, which is bonkers.
Right.
Because it's the foundation of so many people's belief and faith in Mormonism is essentially an unnegatable task. You can't get it wrong. You have to come out with a certain outcome, otherwise you didn't do it properly.
Right.
It's insane. Any other common logical fallacies that we see in Mormonism?
Oh, absolutely. So AdHominem.
That's a whole school. Let's look at that.
That's a huge one. So AdHominem, if I'm not mistaken, that's Latin for to the person, and that's a personal attack. So as somebody who criticizes the church online, I have experienced this regularly where I will say something like, the Book of Mormon is demonstrably not what it claims to be. And then the response is something like, stop watching porn, or you're an adulterer, or you're a miserable person, right? Just leave other people alone. My existence has absolutely nothing to do with the claim, right? We're talking about the Book of Mormon and whether it is what it claims to be. And so when somebody responds to a claim or an argument or a criticism by shifting the attention toward the person making the claim, then they're probably guilty of an ad hominem, a personal attack. So there's that in terms of interacting with apologists, but it also exists in the form of poisoning the well, which is another kind of ad hominem, where people are they have their minds preemptively poisoned against what somebody will say. So we see that with apostates and critics all the time. Lazy learners,
lax disciples,
their lives are full of fear, they're miserable, they're unhappy.
Their countenances have fallen.
Right. Exactly.
Can't believe a word they say.
All of that in an effort to discredit us, anybody who has such a...
Don't they say going to someone who left the church to determine whether it's true is like going to Judas to ask about Christ?
Yeah.
Who said that? I can't remember, but that has been said of those that leave the church.
Many times. And then maybe the more positive way, or it's just another way to say it, is if you want to learn about the Mormons, talk to a Mormon. Just apply that. And the implication is, it's not always spoken as the next sentence, but the implication is, and don't talk to ex-Mormons. Don't talk to the critics. But we don't follow that logic. Like a good faithful Mormon doesn't follow that logic in any other area of their life. If they're looking to buy a new cell phone or a car or any product, I'll speak for myself. I look at the 1-star reviews. I don't only pay attention to the rosy marketing prose and ads from the person who's trying to sell it to me. Right? 1-star reviews include important information. So automatically discounting somebody because they have a negative opinion about a thing is not a way to arrive at the truth.
No,
right? So,
not at all.
yeah.
Otherwise, there's an underlying assumption that something is inherently and only positive in nature, and that's what seems to be implicit in the Mormon worldview, is that Mormonism is only good. There is nothing negative about it, and so anything negative, therefore, is untrue.
Right.
Because it's about feelings. It's feelings based. Mormonism is meant to make you feel good, and it is meant to be good. It is. There is nothing inherently unpleasant in any way, which is just so untrue.
Right. Yeah. There's no valid reason to leave Mormonism, in short. But to your point about it being feelings based, that is the basis for another logical fallacy, the appeal to emotion.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is the most pernicious and pervasive and damaging fallacy of them all when it comes to the LDS Church, because that's the basis for the whole house of cards. And we teach this as missionaries explicitly, okay? And like the Moroni Promise thing. So you're going to read this book, or you're going to hear this music, or you're going to watch this video clip, and you're going to feel something. Therefore, the Book of Mormon is a historic record of ancient Jews, and it is all of these things that it is demonstrably not. And then once somebody's hooked on that or buys into that bogus epistemology, then you don't even have to say the words anymore. It's just implicit in every spiritual experience, in every feelings experience, where, oh, brothers and sisters, it's been so good to be here in sacrament meeting today or in general conference. We've felt the Spirit, which just means we had an emotional response to the things that were said and that we heard.
Experienced emotional uplift.
And the often unspoken implication, fallacious implication, is, therefore, this is all true, factual, historical, right?
I think that comes with the idea that we say we know things, and truth as a word is being used so like this, right? I was talking to Jonathan Streeter about this, that sometimes when Russell M. Nelson says prophets teach the truth, when Wendy Nelson say prophets speak the truth, I can say you're wrong, you're a liar, because I can prove it.
Right.
Because the truth is provable.
Right.
But they will also say apostles speak truths. Now, truths becomes a bit of a lawyery language that you can say, oh, well, truths actually mean things that uplift people and make them believe in the church more. Those are truths as far as the church is concerned. And so we can then apply that to those things, and no one can say, well, you're lying, so that's not true. It's like, well, hang on, no, because that's not what truths means. Yeah. So we get into this redefinition of terms, which I'm not sure if there's a logical fallacy term for it.
Indeed there is. It's called equivocation.
It's called, equivocation.
Equivocation, yeah. Or...
there'll be false equivocation at some point.
The main one that I call it is equivocation. Yeah. That's where you use the ambiguity of language to mislead people. And so truth is a super fun word for apologists and believers to abuse. And that example you provided, where Russell M. Nelson claims that prophets always speak the truth. No, they don't. That's why you have disavowals of past prophetic words on your website. It's because they don't. Like, they don't.
Yeah.
But then, as you said, they use the word, and then when they're called on it, then they interpret it in a different way. When, of course, members make their life decisions based on the reality and the truth of what the prophets are saying, what the church leaders are saying.
Yeah. Because M. Russell Ballard said to a group of people, BYU, he said, there has been no attempt in any way on the part of church leaders to hide anything from anybody. I've listened to that so many times, I believe that's an exact quote. But that's what he said. You think, well, this is not true. You're talking about an account of the first vision that was hidden in a vault for decades. You know that.
Yeah.
So don't come at me with this. And one of the arguments I've had with Area 70s, with bishops, stake presidents, is that, well, they're not... They try and appeal to intent. They try and say, well, they don't mean to lie.
Right. Yeah.
And what I want to talk to you about is a technique that I've learned, which is giving ground where it's necessary to give ground. So I was able in that discussion to say, right, fair enough. Let's take the word lying off the table for a moment. Let's say they're not lying. Let's agree that what they've said is something that is untrue. And once it has been shown to them, when the Salt Lake Tribune reached out to Dan Lake Jokes and said, shock therapy happened under your tenure,
right,
and he refused comment, then
right.
what he has done is he has refused to amend his untrue statement.
Yes.
Therefore, he's making no attempt to make the truth known. What do we call that?
Dishonesty.
Dishonesty.
Yes, absolutely.
Because emotionally charged language like lying switches people off. So sometimes when you're having these conversations, you have to take a step back and almost meet them where they are, I've found, and say, right, let's not talk about lying then. Let's talk about whether things are honest or dishonest, or even just whether they're true or not. Let's get to the basis of whether this is true or not. Because if you can't agree on that, then almost everything else is almost not,
and of course,
necessary.
So, with a lot of logical fallacies, I think that you can assume the best of intent with the people who are making the fallacious argument. Like, they just don't see how it's fallacious, and so they trip and they stumble on the fallacy. In this particular case, it's hard for me to assign the best of intent to the statement, like, we always teach the truth. And then to claim that it means they teach the truth to the best of their understanding, this is like a recent apologist justification that I've had thrown at me.
But their understanding should be better than mine, because they claim direct ability to speak with God. So they should understand the truth better than I do. And this comes to steel manning, which is something that we talk about straw man arguments a lot of the time, but steel manning is the opposite of that. You make the best possible case for someone, and ascribing good intent is one of the ways I've always found is a good way to start steel manning your opposition, as it were. If I look at the apostles and say, okay, right, they're not meaning to lie, they truly believe what they're saying, it doesn't stop the ultimate conclusion that what they're saying is false, but it draws me away from any temptation of AdHominem, and it draws me away from any sort of bad faith discussion, because I'm putting them in the best possible position, knowing that still what they've said is not true. Do you find that effective? Do you find that the case on your end?
So yeah, everything you said is good and true, and I feel like steel manning should be part of our intellectual code of conduct right from the beginning. Where
Agreed.
It's good when you can assume the best intent about the other person, but whether you can do that or not, and whether you do that or not, you have to take the argument that they seem to be making and respond to the best, strongest interpretation of it. So failing to do that, misrepresenting it in a way that allows you to easily knock it down is one of the named fallacies, a straw man.
Which is why it's what I think was so brilliant about Socrates and the way his Socratic method works, is that you continually ask the other party whether you have correctly understood them, and whether you are fairly describing their argument. You give them the chance to correct you, and I find that humility plays a big part in that. You've got to be willing for someone to correct you, because if you come in thinking, I know they're wrong and I'm going to prove it, that doesn't always lead to the best discussions and the best outcomes.
Agreed. And there have been times when, on more than one occasion, I feel like I have not in any way misrepresented what the other person was saying, and then through the dialectic lead them to something that they don't like, lead them to a conclusion that's reprehensible to their morality or their beliefs, then they claim that I've misrepresented what their argument is.
When in reality, what they've done is they've shifted the goalposts.
Yes.
Which is another named thing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
They don't like the fact that you're getting close, and then you go, well, okay.
Yeah.
Fine. We were going down the path together, but then...
Right.
And you can tell when someone's seeing where it's going.
Yes.
And they don't like it.
Yeah, where then they say, like, I feel like you're trying to trap me in a corner. Well, I am trying to show you what logically follows from everything that we've started with.
But the entrapment comes from the weakness of your position, not from this logic.
It's not nefarious or malicious for me to try to demonstrate the error of your position. That's we're talking about ideas. That's the whole purpose of this intellectual discourse, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. That's why we're doing it. It's why we're having a discussion about it. But what would you say to those that just don't want to talk about it? They don't want logic. They just want to feel good. They want their warm fuzzies. They want to turn up on a Sunday, be reassured, and they want to go home. Why is that not good enough?
Well, there are definitely people who are not interested in the evidence. So I guess I can recognize and acknowledge right off the bat that for me, the truth is one of my top values. And so I'm deeply interested in that. For people who are not interested in considering the evidence, like maybe they look at the evidence and they come to a different conclusion. But for the people who aren't even interested in considering the evidence, that can lead to all kinds of atrocities and reprehensible things and stunted growth and death and wars. And
though we have to be careful not to make a slippery slope argument there, Sam.
Does not necessarily. It's not like ignoring a particular piece of evidence will necessarily lead to this.
Leads to genocide. Yeah, it's not quite that severe.
But I can provide specific examples where, just the fallacious nature of a feelings-based epistemology. There are people who sincerely believe that when they pray, it affects the weather, or when they pray, it affects medical outcomes beyond a placebo effect. And this is not something that we just need to wonder about and take on faith. This is a claim about reality. This is a claim about things that can be observed, and we have observed them, and it is a false claim.
Yeah. It's one of the great things about Mormonism that I explain to people as to why it's different to just Christianity or your sort of gentle Anglican Christianity. The reason Mormonism's different is because this is not about what we believe. This is about the way the world is.
Yes.
For many Mormons, this is the state of things. This is the nature of everything. This is not just... It's not like I exist in the same world as everyone else, but I happen to believe there's a God directing things. It's like, no, there is a genuine difference in my perception of reality because I believe that when I lose my car keys, God will find them for me. But when a poor starving child gets a botfly infestation, then God does nothing. Right? There are people that hold that and say, well, that's just poor luck.
Yeah.
Or God's plan or whatever. They conceive of reality in that way.
Right. And so they tell themselves a story about, that person had to suffer in order for there to be an opportunity for me, who's privileged and wealthy, to serve. Or that person was born with dark skin because before they were born, they were less valiant. Just completely unfounded claims. And so can I show evidence that proves that somebody didn't make poor choices or was less valiant in a life before this one? No. And so my response to that is, you should have a foundation for your beliefs. It's fundamentally dangerous, I think, to say, I just need to have faith. I don't need to have a reason for my beliefs. So I could claim I believe that there are invisible little green men dancing on my ceiling right now. And I could keep on running with that. There's no reason for me to believe that, but can you prove me wrong? And there's an example of burden shifting fallacy, acting as if your inability to prove the non-existence of undetectable beings is somehow evidence for the existence of those beings.
Can we talk about the burden of proof and who it should rightly rest on? Because I feel like that's a misunderstood thing sometimes, and it'd be worth talking about.
When somebody makes a claim, they have an obligation to justify the claim. This is just like a generally accepted rule of intellectual conduct. If you make a claim, you have the obligation or the burden of proof to demonstrate that claim. And so the burden of proof or burden shifting fallacy occurs when somebody acts as if they have fulfilled that obligation when they have not, like claiming Jesus walked on water, and then somebody says, "What's the proof for that?" And then they say,
like,
"Well,
proof you didn't."
The Bible said, well, that's one flavor of it is to say, "Can you prove that he didn't?" Right?
Yeah.
To act as if the other person has the obligation to disprove. But then another flavor of it is to act as if the person making the claim has fulfilled the obligation when they have not. And so Jesus walked on water. Oh, really? What's the proof? It says in the Bible. And then ... Like that's the end of the story. Like that proved it.
Which they can use that. They can say fine, it says so in the Bible. And okay, you accept that person believes the Bible to be literally true. But then you get to examine their evidence that they've presented. The evidence they've presented is the Bible. Okay, let's now examine whether that is good evidence or not. It's like if someone comes to me and says, this medical procedure works because this paper says so. I'm like, fine, cool. Okay, you have supplied some evidence. But I now get to look at that paper. I now get to dissect that paper. I now get to look for biases of the author. I get to look for financial gains they might have had. I get to look for whether it's statistically significant, all those sorts of things.
Reproducible.
Yeah, I get to examine the evidence.
Absolutely.
And being able to examine the evidence is really important if someone claims to have provided evidence.
And speaking of evidence, another important thing I think to understand is that the nature of what constitutes sufficient, relevant, and acceptable evidence depends on what the claim is.
Yeah.
So if you tell me you had pancakes for breakfast, your word, like your testimony, is a kind of evidence, and it's sufficient evidence for me to simply accept that, okay, you had pancakes for breakfast. If you tell me that you flew your broom to soccer practice, your testimony is not going to be sufficient for me. If you provided a cell phone video of you flying a broom to soccer practice, that still won't be sufficient evidence for me, right? So extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And so the fact that somebody wrote something down 100 years after Jesus supposedly lived, sorry, that just doesn't constitute evidence that he walked on water. In addition to all the other criticisms that could be made against that evidence.
Yeah, no, I get you. So one of the most powerful things I think you can do in a discussion with someone is correctly rebut. I was loath to bring Ben Shapiro into this, but I'm going to bring him in for a brief moment because, like, love him or loathe him, you have to understand he's very good at one particular thing when he debates, and it is understanding what his obligations are and aren't. So if someone attacks him personally, he understands that he is not obliged in that debate to defend himself. That doesn't matter. If someone goes after him personally, they commit an AdHominem attack. Rather than letting that bog him down or getting stuck in having to defend himself, he just brings things back to the facts. The other thing is understanding when a burden of proof is not his to supply. And if you can understand that as an individual in a discussion, If someone either gives you the Bible says so, or the Book of Mormon says that this is how I'll know if the Book of Mormon is true, or they say, well, prove that the Book of Mormon isn't true. If you can say, that's not my responsibility to prove, and explain why, it's a really powerful tool in having these conversations, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. So in studying these fallacies and understanding what happened, like you're having a conversation, you're trying to explore an idea or prove a point, and then all of a sudden you find yourself explaining that you're not an adulterer, or that you find yourself trying to disprove something because you've taken on that burden of proof, then you get completely knocked off course.
Yeah.
Discussions just spin around in circles. They bounce all over the place. They're not productive. And so I think that's another reason for understanding these things, is that you can do just what you said. Ignore the ad hominem, reject the burden shifting, and just keep on plowing forward toward.
And that doesn't have to be an aggressive thing. It doesn't. Sure. This is one of the things I really want to try and model with this discussion and hopefully convey, is that these sorts of conversations do not need to be scary. They don't need to be aggressive or intimidating. And we talk about intellectual standards or logical standards, but that doesn't mean you have to be an intellectual. You don't have to be, I'm not that smart. You don't have to be that smart to do this stuff, because it's not about that kind of intellect. They don't even have to be big ideas. It's just about being consistent with your beliefs and with discussing them with other people. It's the way I look at it. It's not, there shouldn't be a barrier to entry to this. And they're the sort of conversations that can help people have calm discussions, rational discussions. Because rationality, if you can cut through the ad hominem, if you can cut through the emotionally charged language, rationality is a great way to discuss difficult things, I find.
Absolutely.
So those of you out there who are watching this who maybe aren't sure how to talk to your family, talk to your particular believing family about what's going on about these things, you can have more calm, rational discussions with them. They'll be more uncomfortable, they might be more challenging, but there'll be less of the emotionally charged language. Particularly if you can kindly pick them up when they say, well, no, it's just because you weren't praying hard enough. You can say calmly, my personal religiosity actually has nothing to do with the truthfulness of these claims.
Right.
Right?
Absolutely. And I think that's important, because I think most people value being logical. They like to think of themselves as being logical. And so if you can demonstrate that something is not logical, I feel like that's a good way to change minds. They may need time to process it. It's hard to be put on the spot and find that your argument's not standing up. And so we should be gracious and try to not trigger the backfire effect, a cognitive bias, where we cling more tightly to our core beliefs when we're exposed to disconfirming evidence. But yeah, I think most people like to be logical, and so that's another reason why these things.
Well, people like to be perceived as logical.
They like to think of themselves as being logical.
Because I think it's Jonathan Haidt that says it's more important to appear correct than to be correct. And if you're showing someone that you do not believe them to be correct, then that's going to bother them more than whether they actually are or not. Yeah. And that's one of the things we can also struggle with when it comes to being logical, is that things don't feel right, even though they are. You know, and Jonathan Haidt uses this elephant and rider model when he talks about, why people hold tightly to beliefs. He talks about, you have effectively a press secretary sat on top of an elephant. An elephant's charging its way through a jungle, knocking stuff over left, right, and centre. And you've got a man who's hardly in control, sat on the top, apologising for whatever the elephant does and trying to make good out of the situation. And our brains can be like that often. We do things based on gut reaction, on feeling. And then it's down to our logical brain to try and justify to others, externally, of ourselves, justify to them why we did what we did, why we're acting the way we're acting. But if we can try ourselves to quiet that gut feeling based part of ourselves down just a little bit and think more logically about our actions, then that will help us also justify what we do a bit better, I think, and perhaps act a bit better. Not that there's no room for gut feelings in certain things, in certain places. They're very important in, knowing whether you're in a good situation physically for your safety or not. You get that feeling this isn't quite right. You get a bit prepped up. We're complex people. We're complex beings.
Absolutely.
Because then you go back to CBT, right? And then you go back to, well, someone's adrenaline levels fly through the roof. Unnecessarily, they shouldn't. And you have to work with someone and help bring them back down and, realize that there's a certain amount of worry and anxiety that makes sense. And then the rest is just unproductive. And you just... I was listening to an interview where someone said, you talk about letting things go and not worrying, but if I'm going to miss my flight, I'm scuppered if I miss my flight. And their kind of meditation teacher said, you're right, but there's a certain amount of worry that makes sense. On the 17th time of worrying about whether you're going to miss your flight or not, it's not productive anymore. You've sufficiently worried, and now you're just over worrying. So I think we have that with our feelings, and there's a certain amount of that makes sense, but after that you kind of have to quiet yourself, I think. Anyway, that was a tangent, wasn't it?
All good.
That was a tangent. So why isn't everyone logical then? That's kind of where we're at the moment. Is everyone logical?
So we like to think of ourselves as being logical, but we are riddled with cognitive biases that we constantly have that we need to be aware of to have any hope of overcoming them. And then we have to constantly be diligent, and even then we're not going to be rational all the time. So that includes confirmation bias, observation bias, the idea like availability bias, like the things that happened to us most recently are weighted much more heavily in our consideration. So no, we are not. Humans are largely irrational. It's our evolutionary inheritance. And so we have to work to overcome it. That's how it's by studying logic and studying our biases that we come to realize that it's not the sacrifice of the Virgin that caused the rain to fall and the sun to come out and the weather to be good, right? That did not cause that. But our cognitive biases would lead us to conclude that this caused that because it preceded that in time.
Yeah. It's to do with our perception of kind of time and viewing that in a linear fashion, which that could take us way off, so I'm not going to get drawn into those weeds. But I think what is interesting about this is that our day-to-day decisions about things like I'm hungry, I need shelter, I need food, are like very base functions we don't need to be uber rational about in a lot of ways. I mean, there's room for it, but we generally tend to run on quite automated things. I think where this logic kind of comes into place, I'm thinking out loud literally right now, so this may make no sense, but what I'm thinking is that you have these large overarching narratives that we tell ourselves about life and about why things are the way they are, and those are the things that really need the most deconstructing with logic, and they're the easiest to do because they're almost the most far removed from your base essential needs. Why the world spins isn't as important as where I'm getting water from, but if all my other needs are met, then I can worry about why the world spins. And I've got a few options for believing why that might be the case. And then it's up to rationality to determine what is the most reasonable of those. What do you think to that?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. There are certain needs that need to be met before we can have the luxury of contemplating our navel and other questions that don't contribute directly to, will I be eaten by a tiger that might be lurking in the brush over there? Lost my train of thought. So once we start asking those questions, it's really important to ask the question in the right way and then approach the question in the right way. So in Alma 32, we're told that we should start with belief. And if we can't muster that, then we should start with a desire to believe. So
Cognitive preloading.
Yeah, right. So reality, if what we're after is figuring out what reality is,
Mm-hmm.
reality doesn't care one bit about what you want to believe.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to arrive at some conclusion, you should, like, alarms should be going off in your head that you have a bias that might cause you to ignore certain evidence or overweight other evidence.
So would you say a cognitive bias is a manifestation of where you desire your chain of reasoning to end up?
That's one. So there's a variety of biases that are in that vein, where what we want to believe, we find the evidence to believe it, we ignore evidence that disconfirms it. Yeah,
And we're very good at it.
We are very good.
Very
at
good.
It. So, and then another part of the approach to those questions. So, skepticism needs to be part of the approach, and that implies that we deliberately try to disprove the proposition. So the Book of Mormon is a historic record. The Book of Mormon itself says you need to want to believe that, and then you need to keep on praying until you get a positive answer. Like, that's the way that you can know that it is a historic record. The skeptical approach would be to ask, what would the world look like? What evidence would there be in the world if this claim was not true? And as it happens, we live in a world where that's full of the things that we would expect if it's not true. In addition to all of the things going on in Joseph Smith's life around when he brought forth the Book of Mormon, the text itself includes anachronisms, linguistic, archaeological anachronisms, plagiarisms, errors from 16th century King James version of the Bible, on and on and on, right? All of that is consistent with it being a 19th century work of religious fan fiction.
Yeah.
So, and then there's zero evidence that supports the claim. So it's not just the negative evidence that we have a mountain of. We don't see the things that we would expect to see in the world where it is what it claims to be. There's the things that the Book of Mormon does not mention.
You would expect it to.
The cultural things that existed among the people of the Americas. So skepticism is an important way that we need to approach questions, and we need to deliberately try to disprove the things that we believe. We need to challenge our beliefs continuously, I think.
I want to talk to you about trust a little bit. Wendy Nelson, when she encouraged us to put a question mark after everything in the media, social and mainstream, I'm paraphrasing, and put an exclamation mark after everything that her husband says, for the next 30 days, it builds on a mistrust that seemingly already exists within a certain faction of Mormonism, a mistrust of science, a mistrust of media sources. And we talk about skepticism, and it's important and healthy and good, and we've shown good reasons for it. But what happens to those who are too skeptical or believe things without any sort of rationalization as to why, and so therefore end up believing things that are demonstrably false, like certain YouTube videos saying that the vaccine has a microchip in it from Bill Gates or something like that, right? That sort of stuff. How do we deal with those people? How do we have discussions with people like that?
Well, I've had people push back on me when I say that they should approach their beliefs with skepticism, and they act as if. So here's another fallacy, the false dilemma, where you present only two possibilities when there are other possibilities.
So like the false binary, is that another way of... Yeah.
So they want to say that it's either desire to believe, like lap it all up, embrace it, don't have faith, or radical skepticism, where you can't be sure that you even exist, and like you can't ever trust your senses. So I don't know anybody like that personally. I feel like I know a lot of people who are not skeptical enough,
Hmm.
but I'm unaware of a practical problem in the world with people being excessively skeptical. So I
Okay.
would say I'm not worried about that one bit. And then how do we deal with, or what do we say to people
Yeah,
who
how do you have a discussion with someone who dismisses reasonable evidence? Essentially, is what I'm saying.
if reason didn't take them to their position, it's hard for reason to get them out.
What did it say? You can't reason someone out of a position they were never reasoned into.
Yeah.
Is that the saying?
Well, yeah. So there is truth in that. I try, and I think it can be a debiasing technique
Hmm.
to separate the individual from the immediate thing that they are attached to.
Hmm.
So very frequently, I will present a dilemma or a question or a criticism, not directly about the LDS Church or its truth claims, but shifted slightly, adapted to a different group, a different claim that just about every member of the church would readily acknowledge, like, yes,
That's a
yes,
wrong. Yeah.
your analysis, your criticism of that situation is spot on. And so it doesn't mean that they will necessarily accept
Hmm.
the analogy, that like the direct parallel.
Well, yeah, they'll cry false equivalency. They'll say, well, these two things aren't the same.
Yes, they
Yeah.
do that. They do make the special pleading, but that's an approach
Hmm.
that sometimes can help.
Well, you do it with cults, don't you? When you're trying to get someone out of a cult, you show them other cults,
Yeah,
and you let it sink in. They might start to see, hang on, this is happening to me too. So if I don't like that and I think that's wrong, and then it's happening to me, maybe what's happening to me is wrong too.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if somebody speaking, say David Koresh's wife, one of his wives in the compound, said, "Hey, everybody, how about for the next 30 days we all put an exclamation point behind everything David Koresh says, and we question everything that our non-Branch Davidian family members and outsiders say." Like what? And then she went on to say, "Can you imagine?" Not remembering
Yeah,
exactly.
the reduction in your anxiety, how
Like
peaceful you would be. Yeah.
the effect that this would have on the heart and mind of
Yeah.
somebody who did this. And so ask that same question. What effect would taking up the wife of David Koresh in setting aside any questioning, setting aside critical thinking, and just lapping up everything he says, while amping up the skepticism and the questioning of anybody, any outside voice? What effect would that have on the heart and the mind of such a person? I think they can clearly see that that would not be healthy. It would not be helpful.
And that's kind of what I was thinking about when I was talking about that over skepticism. I suppose you could actually view it as a malassigned skepticism, or not true skepticism, because I think what I'm actually live on air working out is that actually I wasn't necessarily talking about skepticism. I'm maybe more talking about ignoring things you don't like, because skepticism is questioning with as little bias as possible as to the outcome of the questioning. I would think, rather than what I was maybe describing, which is ignoring evidence you don't like.
Right. Yeah.
Calling yourself skeptical, which actually is just you've got confirmation bias towards a certain outcome.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not true skepticism.
And there's Occam's razor can be a helpful tool in there.
Well, explain that, please.
That's the idea that when you have multiple explanations for a phenomenon, you should choose the simplest one, the one that involves introducing the fewest entities, the one that requires making the fewest assumptions. And so when you don't, and so Occam's razor, like, reality is not obligated to be the simplest. So it's not like this is some kind of true inherent reality of the universe. But you can see when people don't follow this principle or pay it no heed, then the stories just get bigger and bigger and more intricate and more detailed. and more
Yeah.
like mental gymnastics and trying to make everything fit together, where you end up with crazy conspiracy theories where you're one of the like the enlightened few, while everybody else is duped by the Illuminati or whatever it is. Rather than, well, like
the simplest explanation that I could be wrong.
Vaccines work, and
yeah. Let's not get into that.
Right. Sure.
I've already mentioned it once, and who knows where that could go. So when trying to address some of this, I think there is a necessary humility that we have to accept that we may be wrong. Sometimes, how can you develop that? How have you developed that yourself? The humility to realize that you could be wrong.
That's a great question, and it's something that I don't know that you're ever done, because, well, let me back up. How did I develop that? I discovered about 40 years into life that I was completely wrong about some huge things. It wasn't like, oh, I didn't hear what you said correctly. Like, I was mistaken. I was wrong about some minor thing. I was wrong about big things.
It'll humble you.
That definitely humbled me. So that definitely allowed me to realize that I can be wrong. And I previously, I think the LDS culture is one that encourages and celebrates a closed belief system, where it's a passing a test of your faith to come up against disconfirming evidence and not change your mind, and not have your perspective changed. That's absolutely celebrated. And I recognize that now. I recognize that it's harmful. And so I try to maintain an open belief system where I am willing to change my mind. So it's one thing to say the words, perhaps it's another thing to actually do it, but I'm not celebrating a closed belief system anymore. I'm saying the words. I value changing my mind when I'm presented with new evidence that would necessitate me to change my mind.
So one of the ways I've got involved in that is through my YouTube videos. Oftentimes, let's think of an example. Someone will come to a video and say, "You're wrong." Just those words, 2 words, "You're wrong." "The prophet's a wonderful man." "You're wrong." Okay. And I'll ask them, rather than get upset by that, which initially I would find quite upsetting, and I struggled with this, I now say, okay, I'd love for you to correct me. Please show me some examples of where I'm wrong. 90% of the time, I never hear from them again. Because that's a way of separating someone who wants to have a conversation with you about why they think you're wrong to someone that wants to defend their own beliefs by declaring your ideas wrong so they can move on. They've come up against the disconfirming evidence. They've carried on to believe what they want to believe by writing me off and saying that out loud, that I'm wrong. So that's one of the ways that I keep myself accountable to being willing to change my mind, is by inviting disconfirming evidence from others to my predisposition that I've produced a video where I am factually correct to the best of my knowledge. That's how I will come into these videos, thinking, well, I've come to a conclusion. I've spotted a load of problems with what they've said. I've declared those problems out loud. If I'm wrong, someone correct me.
Yeah.
Because that way, I hold myself accountable. Go on. Sorry.
Excellent point. Yeah, and so that's triggered in my mind some other things that I try to do to also maintain an open belief system. And I think some of it goes back to that skepticism we talked about, where it's not just skepticism that's directed outward at the people who think differently and believe differently than me, but it's skepticism at my own beliefs. So I express a position, and then somebody says, no, that's not the case. Then, just as you said, okay, I'm now inviting you to show
The burden of
evidence
proof is on
that,
them. They've
exactly.
made a claim.
Yeah. And also to not create an echo chamber where I want to be challenged in my beliefs. I want my thinking and my ideas to be exposed to criticism rather than to be protected under some bubble and not challenged. I think that's another way to maintain that humility. I guess some people might view that as you're just being belligerent or like you want to pick a fight, and I can understand that perspective, and like I'm prone to the backfire effect and other biases that might cause me to start move into a lizard brain way of thinking and be less rational. I think it's a matter of coming back home to your values that I do believe in skepticism. I do believe in the truth. I am interested in the truth. If I'm all wrong about my current positions, I want to know.
Yeah.
I have heard people say before, even if it's not true, meaning the LDS Church, it's still like I would still do it all the same way. Like that just blows my mind. I want the truth. If I'm not centered on the truth right now, if I'm a mile away from the truth, then I want to get closer than I am.
Yeah, I think it was Zelf on the Shelf that said a question to ask someone in the church: if you were in a cult, would you want to know? And if the answer is no, I wouldn't want to know, that should tell you something.
Yeah.
And if the answer is yes, well then have I got news for you, sunshine?
Yes. Yeah, that term is meaningful, is descriptive, and it's also when somebody is in a cult, they never recognize it, right? Cult members never recognize that they're in a cult. Other people can recognize, oh, that person's in a cult, that person's in a cult. And so an argument that I've made in the past is cult membership, like ascertaining whether you're a member of a cult or not, is a situation where demonstrably you cannot rely on your own perception. But the herd is demonstrably good at identifying cults. So if a whole bunch of other people say that you're in a cult, you should take that as strong evidence that you're in a cult.
But the problem is then we have this saying, cult is just a word for a religion I don't like. And it's I think without getting too lost in the weeds on the cult thing, I think this is why the work of Steve Hassan's important and other people in trying to actually define what the characteristics of a cult are, what are the red flags we really need to look for in any organization. What is unhealthy behavior in an organization that we could reasonably term a cult? And those are the things we want to keep people out of, regardless of what they are. We don't want people in situations where their freedom is compromised, which is a very American idea, and other parts of the world may not agree. But a very freedom-based idea that we want people to be as free as possible to do whatever they want. Yeah.
Do you want to talk about other logical fallacies?
Sure. Are there any others you can think of off the top of your head?
Oh, there are plenty.
So many.
One that I was pleased to discover has a name that allowed me to recognize it happening in conversations more readily is the Mott and Bailey fallacy.
Ah.
Are you familiar with this one?
I'm familiar with what it's named after. We have them all over the shop around here.
Okay,
but I couldn't give you a definition. So please do tell.
So correct me if I'm wrong with the terminology, but my understanding is that this harkens back to like feudal days, and that a bailey was the less defensible area of a manor or
the
a settled region where there'd be the animals and the peasants would live. And when the settlement came under attack, everybody would evacuate the bailey and move into the mud, which is an elevated and highly fortified and much defensible, like an easily defended place. So That's where the name of the fallacy comes from, and this is what happens in the fallacy. Somebody makes what's called the Bailey claim. They make a sweeping and largely indefensible claim.
Mm-hmm.
Then they get challenged on the claim, and then they retreat to the mutt, and they act as if the claim that they made is actually a very reasonable, not controversial, easily defended claim. And then when the critic or the person who challenged them fails to attack the mutt, the reasonable claim,
Mm-hmm.
then they act as if the Bailey was defended.
Yes.
Or when,
Spot on. Yeah.
Yeah. So one way that I've experienced this happening is a claim like prayer heals the sick, raises the dead, gives sight to the blind, causes the lame to walk. That's not what the science shows. And then they retort, science shows that prayer affects people's health. And of course, that's true. Mm-hmm. Meditation affects people's health, right? And prayer is a form of meditation. And then I say, yeah, of course. Yeah, I acknowledge that. And then they say, well, you admit that prayer has great power. Like,
no, I don't.
As if the original claim had not been refuted, or at least as if they had established the original claim.
Yeah, it's could I think of one on the spot to do with the Book of Mormon? You know, you would say that the Book of Mormon is divine scripture. And you're like, well, Book of Mormon is divine scripture and a historical record of ancient America. Let's go with that, right? Mm-hmm. And you say, well, the archaeological evidence shows that it isn't. And there are some questionable things about Joseph Smith's account of his divine meetings with both Moroni and with God and Jesus, right? So there's those things. And they say, oh, well, yes, but people take comfort from reading the Book of Mormon. And you're like, well, yeah, okay. Yeah, some people do take comfort from reading the Book of Mormon. So you admit that it's divine and inspired and spiritual. No, I don't.
Right.
Similar thing, right?
Yes, exactly.
I think there's a case of putting words in people's mouths sometimes where you say, so you're saying is... Yeah. And if anyone's watched the interview with Jordan Peterson on Channel 4, she gives such a good example of that, just straw man after straw man. So what you're saying is, no, that's not what he was saying.
Yeah,
not at all.
Not her best
Kathy
day.
Newman was not having a good day that day.
Yeah.
Bless her. Right. Yeah, so, go on, carry on. Go on, please.
Another fallacy that I learned about as I studied these is the courtier's reply. Mm-hmm. And so you think of a member of a royal court.
Niche now.
And this is one that is kind of inspired by the story of the Emperor's New Clothes, mm-hmm. where at the end of the story, the young child says, why is he naked? Right? The young child just makes a criticism or makes a claim. And then the fallacy here comes in when the member of the royal court, the courtier, says, you're just a boy. Like, you're just a girl. You're just a child. You're not mm-hmm. qualified to enter this debate. You're not qualified to enter the criticism. Rather than addressing the criticism, mm-hmm. it's an attempt to preemptively disqualify the critic from participating in the discussion. And mm-hmm. so we see that, I've seen that with criticism of facts of history. And then the response is, oh, are you a historian? I didn't think so. Like, you can't weigh in here.
Mm-hmm. It's like, I don't need to be a historian to understand the facts as a historian has presented them to me through research. Right.
Exactly.
This is the value of human communication.
Right.
I want to really take speaking of kind of disqualifying people from the discussion, one of the ways I think the church tries to do that is make apostates out of people. Now, you rather famously in this crowd, I'd say, were excommunicated from the church for writing things on Facebook. And so I'm going to ask you a question that we spoke about a little bit before in the green room, which is just a question that this is not about logical fallacies necessarily, it's just a bit of a bonus question. As someone who's been excommunicated, Sam Pinson, why haven't I?
That's a great question, and I don't I can offer some ideas.
Yeah,
Ultimately, I'm not the one who knows the answer to that. I
of
guess it'd
course
be your stake president.
it is.
I think that's the first thing that I would say is the leadership roulette.
Hmm.
That can be a factor of it, uh, and the way the leaders respond is informed by the unfolding of events. So as these excommunications have happened, well, like it brings bad press for the church,
Hmm.
and so then it makes future excommunications potentially less likely because they don't win when they do
Hmm.
that, right? They don't like having members of the church be critical or ask unpleasant questions, but excommunicating somebody who's presenting truth in a calm, rational way and asking questions doesn't look good for them.
No.
I'd say those are a couple of reasons. Um, I don't know. I was a bishop. Maybe that's a factor. So that's certainly a claim that was or part of the decision that was explained to me in my excommunication. Like, we can't allow you to do this because you, as it was presented to me, you are a bishop. And I said, I'm not a bishop. Once a bishop, always a bishop. Like, I am not a bishop. Anyway, so that was part of what my stake president explained to me.
Mm.
Um,
I'm just too young.
do you have any thoughts?
I have no idea, to be honest with you. I'm not avoiding excommunication. I'll put it that way. You know, that if I was trying to avoid excommunication, I wouldn't have done half of what I've done. I wouldn't be here talking to you about the false claims of the church, and maybe I don't talk about that enough. Maybe I don't say on air enough. That things are demonstrably false, like the Book of Mormon and such.
Yeah.
You know,
They told.
go on, please.
Oh, so my bishop and stake president told me to shut up, basically. They told me to stop posting on Facebook, and I told them I'm not going to. And some of the criticisms that I included, I guess, didn't leave any room for a faithful interpretation on their part. I said that the God of Mormonism is racist. I said Russell M. Nelson is a liar. And I don't know. I can't remember now. There was one other kind of inflammatory charge.
I mean, I've called them liars publicly.
So you're doing that.
Proven it.
You're doing that already.
Yeah. So, and
I don't
it's
know.
true. They are
Maybe.
liars. I'll say it again. They're lying to us.
Yes.
They're
Yes,
lying to us,
they
and they're
are.
stealing from us. They're stealing
Yeah.
our money by taking it, saying that they're using it for things they're not using it for. The humanitarian aid fund in the UK is a great example. It's almost £5 million just sat there. And all these poor old dears have been paying their widow's mite for a long time,
Right.
thinking that this is going to help people, and it's just accruing in a bank account.
Yep.
Enzyme Peak's another example of that. And they lie to us. They lie so regularly that I said to my stake president today, I wish that between opposing votes, stuff hadn't happened that would change my opposing vote. But stuff has, because it gets worse. Wendy Nelson opened her mouth this time and started making claims about her husband always telling the truth and all
Right.
this sort of stuff. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Tirade over.
And it doesn't seem to me like that'll ever stop or ever be fixed. When the foundation is a lie and fraud, they're never going to come out and say our entire organization is built on a fraud, is a lie. I just don't see that ever happening. And so then you have to keep on trying to patch the holes and stop information from leaking out with more lies.
Yeah, and you just end up in a web of lies.
Yeah.
Should we say lies more, just so it gets picked up by the Strengthened Church Members Committee?
I did not shy away from calling it a lie.
No, neither have I.
I've had people tell me, like, well, like, have you ever lied? Does that make you a liar? And so, like, want to go a lawyer
Yeah.
language analysis on
Well,
me.
they're going too cuckoo on you. They're like, you too as well, so...
Yeah. And so in one interpretation, a rather strict interpretation of the word liar, yes, if I have told a lie, that makes me a liar. Absolutely. I have, right? So the truth is a high priority, but there are absolutely times when I would lie because another higher priority comes into play, like protecting somebody's life to somebody who wishes to cause them harm when I don't owe them the truth. Anyway, without going off in that direction, there's a huge difference between, I think, between like a lie in one instance and a pervasive, like chronic, ongoing, deliberate, intentional
systemic
misrepresentation and lie. And that, when I say Russell M. Nelson is a liar, I don't mean he was speaking off the cuff and he misspoke. That's not what I mean.
Nope.
He knows that he is misleading people. He knows it. He knows the church has disavowed things. Blood atonement, Adam God theory, the racist doctrines that they call theories about blacks.
Well, they call it policy, yeah.
Yeah, the exclusion policy.
Even though the 1947 statement from the first presidency said it is a matter of doctrine.
Absolutely. Claims in General Conference that Native Americans are becoming lighter skinned as they live righteously. The church has said so many things that are false, demonstrably false, can be absolutely proven to be false, that it, in the same breath that they say we always teach the truth, then over in the gospel topic essays they whisper, we've said a whole bunch of things that aren't true. It's lying.
I'm surprised they haven't put Uchtdorf's comment, there are times when we've simply made mistakes. I'm surprised that hasn't been got rid of. Because that is far too close to comfort, I would imagine, for them, to admitting that they've got things wrong.
I think I find that really frustrating because that's kind of revolutionary for an apostle to say church leaders have made mistakes, but he didn't say what those mistakes were.
Nope.
So all we can conclude is Joseph Smith misspelled Simmons Ryder's name, and so it
can be as big or as small as you like it. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So that's like the admission that's not actually an admission.
Yeah.
And of course, there was no apology.
No,
mistakes were made. It's expressed in this passive voice, like we don't know who did what, who the actor was, and what the actions were.
What's that? Let's not get bogged down with who did what to who. Yeah, right.
Occasion.
Exactly. We're just going to move forward. Stop looking to the past. We're looking forward. It's like, no, we need to deal with the past. We need to deal with the underpinnings of this racist institution that we still call a church. We need to deal with that. I know the Mormon Gestapo are probably watching this, so I'm just seeing how many buzzwords I could throw out there. But I think it's really important, coming back to Steel Manning, what I do when I'm researching a video about the lies of Quinton L. Cook, say, I don't look at times where he misspoke. I don't look at times where it's conceivable that he made a mistake.
Right.
You look at times where it's very clear that he wanted people to believe the words that he said that came out of his mouth. So you look at Ballard, when he says there's been no attempt, since the beginning of time, there's been no attempt on the part of the church leaders to hide anything from anybody. Yeah. Very clearly, using Occam's razor, the simplest understanding of those words would be that he believes, and he wants you to believe, he is telling you in sincerity that since the beginning of time there has been no attempt by any of the leaders of the church he represents to hide anything from anybody. All-encompassing terms. So you have to take him on face value. And that is clearly the message he wants to put forward. So then, you know that he knows that's not true. Because he's talking about something in his hand that isn't, that disproves that.
Absolutely.
So you then have to acknowledge that he is trying to lead people to believe something that isn't true. And to do that, to intentionally lead people to believe something that isn't true, is lying. Gospel Principles Handbook points
Yep.
it out.
Yep.
The church's
Yeah.
own standards.
Yeah. And similarly, how grateful I am from the very beginning of the church that it has stood against racism and
In
all its
all its
terrible
malignant
forms.
forms. Yeah,
Yeah.
Elder Morrison.
What a
Yeah.
crazy claim to make. A blatant lie.
Yeah.
Tell the lie big. Tell it often.
Mm-hmm. And then soon tell a lie often enough and it'll become the truth to somebody. Yeah. Okay. So I think we're getting ready to sum all this up, to try and pull all this together into something that people can really take home with them. I think it's been great so far. So how would you advise those who are currently going through a faith crisis to increase these things, other than just kind of studying them? How can you apply them? How can you really take critical thinking on as something
Other than studying them?
other than just, rote trying to memorize them, study them? Like, did you do any sort of exercises where you try to apply them to various things?
I think that having conversations with people who have been through the faith crisis and that you recognize as logical and informed on the issues, that having conversations with them can be helpful. I had conversations with people who were still on the inside, who were trying to explain to me all the ways that I was deceived and wrong, but that had the effect of allowing me to see even more and more fallacies. Beyond studying, yeah, like you could make a deliberate effort to identify, to critically examine. So if you're still going to church and you're sitting there in sacrament meeting or in Sunday school, you could make an effort to examine critically what you're being taught and see if there are appeals to emotion. See if there's AdHominem for people who aren't present, like critics and apostates, and see if any of these things that we've talked about occur. I don't know if that helps.
No, yeah, that was one of the things. Go on.
I think that's hard to do when you're in, but if you've opened up your mind to the possibility that you might be wrong, that your beliefs might be wrong, they might not reflect reality, then that's a great first step. And then I would just say keep on asking questions.
One thing I will say to people as well is that there seems to be this fear that if you open yourself back up to the church, you'll somehow get swallowed back in, right? That if you allow yourself to kind of take on the other perspective, then that might re-trigger some sort of switch in your mind, and the conditioning will come back. I certainly haven't found it to be the case. I don't know about you, but I actually find myself, as an intellectual challenge, irritating some other people in the progressive and ex-Mormon community by commenting on their posts with the caption apologist hat, and then providing apologetic arguments to them, and just arguing from a position that I don't actually believe myself anymore.
Yeah.
And I find that to actually be quite healthy. I don't know what your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. That's part of steelmanning, right? That's something that we should do with our own positions and our own arguments, is anticipate the criticisms, anticipate what the apologist's response would be. And another thing that we haven't brought up yet, that I would say that's very important, is to always, and as much as you can, validate everything, like acknowledge everything valid in the other person's position.
Yeah.
So we said earlier that just because you've apostatized doesn't mean you're logical, and that's obviously true. There are people who are rightly angry and then maybe come out and they may make some unfounded claims about the church. And so I always cringe a little bit when I see stuff like that, because you don't need to go off into unfounded claim territory
Yeah.
in order to make your case for why you left and what's harmful about the church.
Trust me, there's enough here.
Absolutely. We do not
There's
need
enough.
to make stuff up. We don't even need to go into the speculative stuff. Like there's
No.
some stuff where, yeah, maybe that's the case. That's kind of maybe not fully substantiated, but we should acknowledge that, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of questionable. Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. And then acknowledge everything valid that's in the other person's position. So we can say, like, does the church teach anything that's valuable or true? Absolutely, right? I didn't leave the church and then say, what's the church's position on this issue? I'm going to adopt the opposite position, right? So in exploring these things, I feel like what you were saying, the steel manning, adopting the apologist hat, and recognizing everything that they have to say is valid is also an important part of this process.
But then also you can find yourself doing that. I find myself at the point where I'm having to make the logical leaps, and it helps me recognize those logical leaps. It helps me recognize the mental gymnastics. When I get to the point of going, okay, well, if I'm going to keep arguing for this, I'm going to have to be logically inconsistent here. I'm not going to be able to remain consistent to my original premise. When you see that, you realize then, okay, right, so that's where this falls apart. And you can take that with you.
Yeah. And we should acknowledge that when we got it wrong, when we made a claim that doesn't withstand scrutiny, or maybe we overstated our case, it's healthy to admit that.
Yeah, for sure. It is. Okay, so any final words of wisdom from Sam Pinson, the man who puts so many Facebook posts out there about logical fallacies I lose count? It's quite impressive.
I appreciate the opportunity to be on the show, and I appreciate the work that you do. My parting words of wisdom, I can't think of a situation where being logical will not serve you. Maybe I'm too Spock-like, but we live in a world broadening the focus away from just religion. We live in a world where it seems increasingly, maybe you see this less over where you live, but my experience is that the world is becoming increasingly polarized, and AdHominem, demonization of people who have different opinions, is taking the place of rational, logical discussion, and with terrifying consequences. So for so many reasons, to avoid political upheaval, to avoid the country falling to pieces, to avoid being duped, to avoid being trapped in false belief systems, I have found that logic is your unfailing friend, and I just love studying these things and hope other people find this helpful.
Well, it seems like everyone in the chat has been, and they're all thanking you, Sam, for being on here and talking about this. I'd like to thank you too. It's been really informative for me. I always like to try and learn things from these discussions as well. And so thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching. Make sure you are having a good time having these conversations with your family and friends. Don't do these things that upset you, but realize that these might be uncomfortable. And that if you can remove the emotion from it, and if you can try and make it rational and reasonable, then you might stand a better chance of having the conversation and it being more productive. So, on that note, have a great night, everyone. Make sure you subscribe so you know when I'm back doing other things. And I'm going to take some time to recover. See you later.
Thanks again.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.